us? Well, today we are highlighting a growing rift between the African Union and the continent's massive youth population. Now, while the AU was designed to foster stability and democracy, many young Africans now view it as an exclusive old boys club, where aging leaders prioritize protecting one another over the needs of their citizens. This frustration stems from a perceived double standard. That is, the AU is quick to condemn military coups, yet often stays silent when sitting presidents legally manipulate constitutions to scrap term limits and cling to power for decades. Now, this disconnect has led to a significant loss of trust in the institution's ability to enforce change. As more countries face political unrest and military takeovers, there are arguments that the AU is failing to address the root causes of these crises, mainly poor governance and a lack of economic opportunity. Now, for the AU to remain relevant to a generation that is younger and more politically active than ever, it must shift from being a protective shield for heads of states to an organization that truly champions human rights and the democratic will of the people. Now, to speak more on this, we have Yemi Fajemisin. He's a geopolitics analyst in Glasgow, UK. Thank you so much, Yemi, for joining us at this time.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, Yemi, Africa's median age is 19.7, yet its average leader is over 60. With a youth population of 400 million set to double by 2050, is the AU fundamentally a gerontocracy that is biologically incapable of imagining a digital-first future? Speak to us.
Yes, thanks again. I think, in my own view, personally, I don't think the AU is incapable of making reforms.
So what is the problem?
One of the problems we have is the political will to actually enforce discipline within the AU organization itself. So we must, to me, the two fundamental principles of African Union is, number one, to see the end to all the continuous wars that goes on in Africa, and number two, to ease the flow of trade within the African continent. So there's an example, for example, where in Chad, when the son of the late dictator Idris Deby died, the son took over, you will have expected AU to respond to maybe to expel Chad when that happened. But they simply said they didn't see that as a coup, and they turned a blind eye to the situation. Now, you could argue one of the reasons they did that was because Chad is a very important partner when it comes to fighting jihadists around the Sahel region.
Yeah.
So they don't want the political instability in Chad. So they kind of turn a blind eye to that. But they've been doing the same thing in several countries. Very recently, we saw the new female president in Tanzania currently fighting for legitimacy there. And civilians have been killed just because of the last election. So the AU, they've been showing mixed reactions. And some people behind the scenes have even branded the association or the union as more of a secretariat, as opposed to like a big African Union. So there's a mix of things going on there. But in the broader sense, yeah, I think it's safe to say AU has not been doing more than what they should be doing in terms of enforcing discipline.
Yeah, speaking of them not doing what they're meant to be doing, I think they also know what they're supposed to do but have refused to do it, because even outgoing AUC chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat just admitted, he said that youths are constantly challenging us and putting us, on trial for being out of step with their aspirations. So if the leaders know that they're failing the youth, why is the seat at the table still just, a symbolic youth envoy rather than an actual policy power?
Yeah, I think they're definitely failing the youth. And I think one of the reasons is they allow member states to game the system. When AU first started, everything seems to be going all right. But as time goes on, the member states kind of gain, they had the knowledge so to say, to game the system. And that's one of the issue. What I will also say is when we say the youths are not engaged in the system, we must not forget that some of these coup leaders, for example, in Burkina Faso, they are also young guys. Some of them are in their 40s. So you could say they're not old like all the old folks of Museveni in Uganda. So the question we'll be asking is, the junta in Burkina Faso, for example, is a young guy. Why is he not promising a return to democracy? Why is he behaving like all the old folks as well? So far, they're refusing to even return to democracy. He's trying to form an image after himself like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso in those days. So there's a cocktail of issues there. Is one side, it's okay to say the youths are not being encouraged to come to the table to occupy position. We also have on the other hand, where some of these military juntas should know better. They're young guys themselves. So why are they not doing the right thing and say, okay, we want to return to democracy, we want to guarantee a free and fair election, instead of trying to be a despot like the rest of the old folks?
Okay. Now, since 2020, we have seen like 9 successful military coups and at least as many attempts as well. When the AU commends a flawed election, as we saw in Uganda recently, and young people respond by calling it a dictatorship club, would you say that the AU has lost its moral authority to condemn the military juntas as well?
Yeah, to an extent, I think they don't have the moral authority to speak, because they allow some of these old people to do 3 things: change the constitution, use the army against their people to repress them, and maybe in some cases they buy the judge as well. So the AU used to have they have this dream of maybe becoming the European Union in Africa, so to say. But like you said, I think they've lost the moral authority to an extent where they can't even enforce treaties, let alone expel members for doing the wrong things. So to an extent, to me, it's more becoming like a secretariat, like I said earlier, compared to a union. Because we shouldn't forget that one of the things the AU is meant to be doing as well is to speak in one voice. So for Africa to be able to speak in one voice in the world stage. So all these things gives them the lack of moral authority to be able to speak in one voice, whereby they allow countries to just change the constitution. The despot in Rwanda is able to march into Goma in Eastern Congo and just create chaos. So you see Mali, the same thing, Niger, and now Tanzania. So yeah, we can say to an extent that they've got the moral authority there, has been diminished. But that doesn't mean they can't still do a lot. They can still do a lot in their toolbox. They've got a few things they can do. They're just refusing to do it.
Okay. Now, Yemi, the AU recently reported also that 93% of its decisions from the last 3 years have never been implemented. At what point do these summits, because they have endless summits, you know, yearly, year in, year out, at what point do they stop being a union of states and start being viewed as an expensive talk shop for presidents who ignore their own signatures? Because we're actually seeing the Sahelian coup belt form their own alliance, turning their backs on the AU. Some have actually also said that, you know, it's the beginning of a multipolar Africa where the AU's 55 states dream is replaced by regional blocs that prioritize security over democratic values. Let's hear from you.
Yes, when it comes to the Sahel Alliance there's 2 things there, which I want to quickly clarify there. So we have the AES, which is the Alliance of Sahel States. So that comprises of Niger, Mali, and I think Burkina Faso. So that was formed around 2023 or so after they withdrew from the ECOWAS. And what that body is trying to do is mainly in terms of defense, because we know that region, that Sahel region, is very prone to jihadist insurgency. So they came together to do that. There's also an alliance, I think, if I remember correctly, it's called the Sahel Alliance, and that was formed around 2017, more around the development of projects around the Sahel region. So there's two things there. But I think, back to your question, I don't necessarily think they will replace the EU, because the AU is bigger, 55 countries, and we shouldn't forget that the AU also discussed things about the ease flow of trade amongst African countries. The Sahel Alliance in this context is smaller. It's a smaller club, mainly looking at some of them defense area in the Sahel region, because they're very prone to jihadist insurgency, and also the alliance has got to do with the development of projects around the region. So yeah, it's probably a good thing for that region because of the insurgency they face, but I wouldn't think it's going to pose any significant threats as to the African Union as a whole. The African Union may be sloppy in some ways, but they still got their summits they hold. They still do quite a lot when it comes to easing of trade amongst African countries, which easing of trade we must recognize is going to impact the citizens of Africa a little bit positively as well. So I don't think the Sahel Alliance can do it all alone. They still need the support of the African Union to actually do very well, even in terms of the defense or economic-wise.
So official statistics, Yemi, says that youth unemployment is around 9%. But the ILO reveals that 71.7% of young Africans are in precarious employment without contracts or even safety nets. So there's no security at all. So the question is, why is the AU celebrating GDP growth that never reaches the pockets of, the informal worker in Lagos or even in Nairobi?
I'm not an economist, but in this context, I know GDP is often calculated in terms of what happens in the formal economy of countries, which means they take account into your what you're producing and what you're exporting, and also the services, and they measure that in terms of the GDP. In Africa, the issue we have in Africa is quite a lot of African citizens that belong to the informal economy. So it's okay for the government to say, oh yeah, the GDP is doing well, the economy is booming, but the people are not seeing the benefit of it. And why are they not seeing the benefit of it? Because the informal sector are not being taken into account. You take a look at Nigeria, for example. Millions of Nigerians work in the informal sector of the economy, not the formal sector. So if you say to an average Nigerian on the street, for example, that, oh, the GDP is doing well, they probably don't see the effect of that. In Nigerian context, for example, we know one of the good things they've done is that they've streamlined the foreign exchange. They used to be all over the place before, like 4 different foreign exchange. Now it's now in one pot. So they've also ended the subsidy, which has been hemorrhaging the finances for quite a while. So those two things Nigerian government have managed to do, but the people can't see the effect. And one of the reasons why they can't is because Nigeria, they're still servicing so much debt. So there's a lot of economic mixture there. So when you have a country that is owing so much, even though the GDP seems to be doing well, you're owing so much, you're paying so much back on interest as well. So there's no way the people are going to struggle to actually see the effect of the GDP. They may see the effect down the line, but it's going to be maybe a few more years down the line to actually see the effect of any GDP announcement from African governments, which mainly deals with the formal sector. They don't really take account into what goes on in the informal sector, unfortunately.
All right. Now let's move on to the U.S. president, Donald Trump's America First approach, which is reshaping global alliances, right? Would you say that this is the AU's pivot, rather, towards the BRICS Plus, a genuine search for sovereignty, and to involve the citizens as well? Or are we just swapping one set of masters for another in the race for Africa's critical minerals?
Yeah, we know that the Trump administration has been withdrawing from quite a lot of treaties, and they want to be all alone. On one hand, they're preaching protectionism, isolation, want to be isolated. At the same time, they're trying to invade other countries like Venezuela and all that. But in terms of the African context, I don't think African leaders should be shocked as to the position of the U.S. administration. They've been saying that from day one, before they even go into office. African leaders just need to do more to look after its own people as well. Saying that, we know African countries can't do it all alone. They still need the help of a superpower. And who is the superpower that is trying to fill the void now? It's China. If you look at even Europe, for example, the UK Prime Minister was in China a few weeks ago to do a trade deal, which went well. Canada was in China. Canadian Prime Minister was in China as well a few weeks ago doing a deal with the Chinese, which went well. So I think it's going to be a case of many African countries are going to be swapping the US for China, because China is trying to fill the void now. So when it comes to even development and mining of materials, like Nigeria, for example, have quite good materials when it comes to decarbonization. And the Western world needs these things to produce their batteries to decarbonize. So the superpower that's going to be filling the void now looks more like China. So America is saying America first, but it looks like it's going to be Chinese. That's going to be the Chinese that's going to be rewarded when it comes to mineral things, trade deals across the world.
Okay, you talked about China, but China and Russia actually have significantly different views on human rights, than the AU's founding charter. Now, questions abound about how, in a world of transactional diplomacy, can the AU afford to maintain its democratic standards, or is democracy the first thing being traded for infrastructure? And speaking of, democracy, we know that there's been internet shutdowns, which have become a standard tool for AU member states during elections. I mean, last year, we've seen so many of such happen. So why is the AU so vocal about Palestine and what is happening there in Gaza and all that, and not vocal about what is happening to its member states and the citizens?
Yeah, I think in general, most countries they always try to separate what goes on politically and what goes on economically. So every country does that. For instance, in China, as big as China is, every Western country, for example, recognizes that in China, they have this one China policy that every country respects, and which is you must not do any separate deal with Taiwan. Everything needs to be one China. So it's the same thing with Africa, where, for instance, it's okay for them to say things about what's going on in Palestine, especially South Africa. South Africa was on the case of the Palestinian issue because of the historical links between during the apartheid era of South Africa and the Mandela era. And they say that about Palestine, but they don't say anything about what goes on in other African countries. Why? I'm not too sure. I'm guessing maybe because they don't want to annoy their African neighbors. Also, we need to recognize that when it comes to switching off internet during elections, many countries do that. And they do that for different reasons. Some of them will argue that they do that just to make sure violence does not spread. They give that excuse to say, if we leave the internet on, people are going to mobilize themselves, thugs are going to mobilize themselves and set up protests. So it's okay for them to do that to make sure they keep the peace in the country. Other people will argue that they're doing that because they want to rig elections. So there's a different school of thought that will argue for or against switching off our internet when it comes to election season. But what matters here is switching off our internet is quite different from the massacre or the genocide that happened in Palestine. So people do elections, switch off internet without actually killing their citizens. The Palestinian issue is a separate issue where we have powerful states like Israel, supported by a powerful country like America, actually slaughtering people in Gaza. So which made a lot of countries to stand up and to speak against that. So there's two different scenarios there, in my view.
All right. Now, just before we wrap up, let's have your final thoughts, especially where over 3,000 young Africans died in the Mediterranean, in 2023 alone. So if the Africa We Want Agenda 2063 were built, why is the brightest talent on the continent still treating a one-way ticket to Europe as their only hope for the future or for greener pastures?
Yeah, I think African countries need to do more. So the people are fleeing for one reason, or say two reasons why people flee. They flee because of war. For instance, what's going on in Sudan is shocking. So there's a civil war going there. People flee for that. And second, people flee to escape poverty. So African countries has not been doing too well when it comes to actually addressing the needs of their people. I'll give you an example. In Africa, just about 16% of African countries actually trade amongst themselves, compared to 60% of the trade that goes to within Africa, from Africa, that goes to Europe and Asia. So we need to understand why that's the case. Some of the reasons for that is because of the legacy of colonization, where some of these African exporters have a direct link to the market of overseas. So because they have the link to the market overseas, that means they are isolating their African neighbors. So because that alone means a direct poverty on the people of Africa. Yeah. Because imagine a situation where African countries, they can trade with each other freely. That's going to create more jobs. That's going to help people's life as well. So these are the things African Union needs to be addressing.
All right.
When it comes to eating poverty, and that's why people are fleeing to the Mediterranean to escape poverty.
Sadly, Yemi, we actually have to wrap up now. Wish we had more time, but thank you so much for your thoughts and for speaking on this.
Thank you so much.